BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. So, I would like to drop a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that I would like to give a big thank you to everybody who listened to the recent weekend episode on JonBenet Ramsey, which is now a regular segment that comes out every weekend here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. Wednesdays have also been devoted to the story of Jack the Ripper, and Friday is still the Anything Goes, where any subject is fair game. And most recently on the channel, I did an episode for the Anything Goes segment about Richard Speck, the man responsible for the South Chicago massacre, which led to the deaths of 8 women, and believe it or not, there is a Zodiac Killer connection to that, which I will be discussing in the middle part of this episode. But before we go any further, I would like to remind you guys that a great way to help support this channel is to hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends and family if they're curious about true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, human behavior, and because there is the Anything Goes segment, any subject under the sun or in the darkness. And another great way to help out is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the channel, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Before I talk about the Richard Speck connection to the Zodiac Killer mystery, I would like to look at something that was requested by you guys in the comments section. Multiple people asked for a direct response to the History Channel's most recent Zodiac Killer program, Season 4, Episode 2 of the World's Greatest Unsolved Mysteries, and it was available on their website, actually. I have a History Channel app on Discovery Plus, and I was trying to use that and navigate it, but because I had the link right in front of me, I just decided to watch it through the internet, play.history.com, and that's how I was able to access this episode. And some people warned me that they were going to be talking a lot about the suspects and saying some rather superficial things about them, but here is the direct response. And also, I should remind you guys that if anybody has ideas for future episodes or for things that they would like discussed here on Black Box Online Radio, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Currently doing regular segments about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and JonBenet Ramsey. This is the TV show that is narrated by Lawrence Fishburne, and he doesn't participate too much in the program. Most of it was going back and forth between different panelists, like they're taking an interview from somebody, and then they're cutting the interview up into different segments, and they're showing those segments as if the person's actually narrating the episode, but it's pieces of an interview that have been stitched together. Lawrence Fishburne was mostly just doing the introduction and the outro and a few things in the middle, and the first 7 minutes of it really summarized the Zodiac Killer crimes. The first Zodiac Killer incident took place on December 20th of 1968, with the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and they were referred to as just 2 teenagers who were out on their first date. The second Zodiac Killer crime occurred on July 4th of 1969, with the murder of Darlene Ferrant and the shooting of Mike Mageau. Then the Zodiac Killer attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard on September 27th of 1969, wearing a hooded costume at Lake Berryessa. Unlike the previous two crimes, the victims were stabbed in this one. The first two crimes and had murders where the victims were shot, and the final Zodiac crime was the murder of Paul Stine on October 11th of 1969, who was murdered inside of his taxi cab. He was shot in the right side of the head, and he died from a single gunshot wound. So they did some very basic summarizing, but then they got into the Zodiac killer suspects, and they talked about the evidence for and against particular suspects, such as Arthur Lee Allen. And if you haven't seen this program, I want to make this very clear that I'm going to try to talk about this as if you have watched it or you haven't watched it, made available to everyone, and to genuinely talk about Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect. The first point that was brought up is that Allen had criminal tendencies. He was a very deviant person. He also had what Robert Graysmith described as the personality of someone who was trying to rebuild a shattered ego and a shattered life, more or less. He was an athlete. He was a very accomplished diver, but he was also a pedophile. He also was someone who gained a bunch of weight and lost his hair and never really had any job stability. And he also got fired from a rather not exactly prosperous career at a school, but he had employment there, and he wasn't able to secure the most grounded settings in his life. But the evidence that should be placed against Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect are: number one, he does not appear to match the witness descriptions, not all of them. He matches some, but not all of them, because they talk about how after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, Mike Mageau, the surviving victim, described the Zodiac killer as being 5 feet 8 inches tall and 200 pounds. Maybe the weight is somewhat correct, but Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall, as we can see from his driver's license photo, and I mean just the info that is made available there. And most sources seem to think that yes, Allen was around 6 feet tall. The Robbins kids who saw the Zodiac after the Stein murder also estimated that he was 5 feet 8 inches tall, and it really is a big discrepancy. However, I think the simplest answer is just that the Robbins kids may have misjudged the Zodiac's height because he was a substantial distance away. And what this History Channel show did point out was there's a very big difference between the testimony from the Robbins kids and that of Mike Mageau, because they are independent witnesses. They had no real part in this. They were teenagers. They were not attacked by the killer. They were not targeted by the killer. And one point where I think that almost all parties agree is that the Robbins kids weren't involved. There are countless theories out there talking about how, oh, Mike Mageau was actually much more responsible for the murder of Darlene Ferrin than people thought. And it doesn't even tie into so much the idea that he was the gunman. I mean, obviously not. He was shot multiple times. Or that he orchestrated the crime. The theories involving Mike Mageau as an active participant are more like he was going to the park to buy drugs with Darlene, and a drug dealer who had problems with him showed up and murdered them, or murdered Darlene Ferrin, and was trying to murder Mike Mageau as well. And that the Blue Rock Springs murder was actually a drug-related crime. I mean, we can talk about those things all day long, but there's a lot of mental gymnastics going on with those types of theories. But with the Robbins kids, they're almost non-existent because, again, they are independent witnesses. And I think that that's a rather solid point. The other points against Arthur Lee Allen, which were presented in the program, were that Allen had handwriting that appears to be somewhat different than the Zodiac killer. Allen did not have any physical evidence matching the Zodiac, particularly when they tried to extract DNA from the Zodiac killer's letters. It was specifically the stamp on one of the envelopes, some touch DNA that was found there, and they ran it against Allen's. It didn't come back, although I mean, just to level with you guys, I don't think that was actually the Zodiac's DNA. I think it belonged to somebody else. But the physical descriptions do stand out. The Zodiac was seen with a crew cut. Alan did not have any similar haircut at all. He was balding in 1969, as well as Alan does have different handwriting. I absolutely believe that. And if you look at this one comparison chart that they even showed in the episode, Arthur Lee Allen had a similar lowercase h to that of the killer, and that's what I think it's mostly is. A few other letters are similar, but overall, I think Arthur Lee Allen had rather different handwriting. And not to mention that Allen was a sex offender and the Zodiac crimes were not sexual, and the police were trying to zone in on Arthur Lee Allen, but the evidence just wasn't there. The next suspect they talked about was Richard Gaikowski, and just from watching the episode, I thought they made a much more convincing claim that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac compared to Arthur Lee Allen, even though you guys know I'm not too big on that theory either. But the points in favor are Arthur Lee Allen and Geik have something that is very different between them, and that is that Geik appeared to have a stronger connection to the Zodiac killer victim Darlene Ferrin, and that is the Albany story. The idea that Darlene Ferrin moves to Albany and Gaikowski moves to Albany. Darlene Ferrin moves back to California. Gaikowski moves back to California. And how there's just some type of possible connection between them, and that Darlene Ferrin's role in the Zodiac killer mystery could have been much larger, and there could have been a particular personal vendetta between Gaikowski and Darlene Ferrin. They also talked about how Gaikowski may have been out of the country in December of 1968 for the Lake Herman Road murders, and there is some evidence to suggest that. Even Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com posted Gaikowski's passport application on his website, but what was brought up in the History Channel show was that just because somebody had a passport, it doesn't mean that they have traveled on it. And no, I mean, that's a very honest statement, and that is something that we should consider. And also that Gaikowski is somebody who, or indeed the Zodiac may have hidden his name directly in the ciphers by leaving the letters G-Y-K-E, and he went by the nickname Geik for Gaikowski, G-A-I-K, and they even talked about a possible spelling G-I-K-E, also going by the name Dick Geik. And then just there it is in the cipher, G-Y-K-E. That's from the 408 cipher, so suggesting that the killer's leaving his name, hiding in plain sight, and he's not going to spell it the conventional way, or the way that he did familiarly, because he didn't want people to recognize it. And there's so many points about Gaikowski where I get very curious, but the counter-argument was that Gaikowski does not seem to have anything other than circumstantial evidence going for him as a suspect. Or what they said was, there is almost no hard evidence. In fact, we could even say it, there is no hard evidence to connect that particular person to the Zodiac crimes, to provide some balance. As far as talking about Richard Gaikowski's activities in the 1960s, the History Channel show said that he was from South Dakota, which is true, and he came to California in 1964. When I did the Richard Gaikowski Ask Me Anything, I received a message from Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com saying that Dick Gaikowski came to California in 1963, and it's possible that he came there in 1962, around the time of the murder of Ray Davis, a possible Zodiac victim, and he would travel around and do a journalistic project called The Battered Typewriter of Dick Gaikowski. So, I mean, again, I follow everything involving the Geik narrative. It's just, will the hard physical evidence support that? And I'm definitely not convinced that it does, as of this point. The next suspect that was mentioned in the program was Earl Van Best Jr., and this all starts from Gary Stewart, the son of Earl Van Best, who was adopted, and Gary Stewart wrote a book called The Most Dangerous Animal of All, and they wanted to zone in on the fact that Gary Stewart has more or less been exposed as a fraud, and they shared some background info on a Hulu docu-miniseries that was made about Earl Van Best and Gary Stewart. And I have done direct responses to that here on Black Box Online Radio. As I said, you can always like and subscribe. And there are now more than 1,000 episodes of Black Box Online Radio, so feel free to go through some of the older ones, even the old Black Box recordings, and you might find something that you're curious about. But with Earl Van Best, Gary Stewart wrote this book where he's telling a very detailed story of his biological father and all of these family stories put together. Earl Van Best going to a family reunion, and then there are just these chapters at the end of the book talking about the Zodiac killer. And in my first book discussion on The Most Dangerous Animal of All, I misstated something, and I said that they're just paraphrasing Robert Graysmith's narrative in the Zodiac letters, almost line by line. And no, they were not. I have to correct myself. Susan Mustafa, the co-writer of that book, said very clearly in the FX docu-series that it wasn't the letters in Graysmith's narrative. They paraphrased the police reports. That doesn't really help them too much. I mean, it's an unrelated story about the Zodiac for 24 chapters. Then there are just a few pieces of speculation, and then there are just pieces of, again, paraphrasing the police reports and trying to turn them into some type of personal narrative. But points about Earl Van Best and the FX series, which is now available on Hulu, that's where I watched it anyway, are that they wanted to do this mini docu-series about Earl Van Best and the book The Most Dangerous Animal of All because it was selling well, but the production company didn't want to just hand over their reputations to Gary Stewart and run wild. So what they did was they had their own investigator look into the story, and number one, Gary Stewart was caught falsifying records where he stated that his father, Earl Van Best Jr., was at a Atascadero State Hospital, a mental hospital where Arthur Lee Allen was also located, and that they even provided a rather convincing piece of evidence to suggest that Gary Stewart had forged documents. And more importantly, even if his son is a liar, well, was Earl Van Best the Zodiac? Then they talked about how his credit cards had activity in Europe, particularly Austria, I believe, from watching the show, although that was 3 years ago when I watched that one. And Earl Van Best's third wife, Edith Coase, was from Austria. Earl Van Best actually grew up trilingual in English, German, and Japanese, and he bonded with a lot of people because of his connections to the German language. Also, his close friend, William Lomas, whom he more or less took advantage of. Again, there's some good stories in The Most Dangerous Animal of All. It's just not Zodiac related. But that's just the whole thesis, conclusion, the ending point of that mini docu-series is that he most likely was in Europe at the time of Zodiac activity and not living near any of the crimes on the West Coast. So I think that that's almost like putting a nail in the coffin. But one point where I didn't really think the presentation of the History Channel show was very strong was they just kept going back and forth between, okay, here's a suspect, let's talk about how he resembles the Zodiac composite sketch. And one of them was Earl Van Best. They were just like, debunk, 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 debunk. Oh, wait, but he does indeed resemble the Zodiac Killer composite sketch. And I was like, well, who cares? It's just a man wearing a pair of dark-rimmed glasses. Lots of them resemble the Zodiac Killer composite sketch in some way. And we have to remember, it's not a photograph. It's not some type of high-resolution image. It's somebody describing what an assailant possibly looked like, whom they barely saw at all, They didn't even spend that much time with the person. They didn't spend any time with the person. Actually, they saw him out of a window. But all the same, I get that they're trying to put on a TV show. The next suspect that was discussed was Gary Francis Post, and longtime Black Box Online Radio followers will know that I am very critical of this particular suspect, and some of the reasons that they shared in the episode didn't go very deep. Number one, that, again, they talk about, well, Gary Francis Post resembles the Zodiac Killer composite sketch, and also he has scars on his forehead which resemble the lines that were drawn on the composite sketch. But almost certainly those are not scars on the composite sketch. They are lines that were added by the artist to fill space or show age. And I definitely believe that that's the case. I mean, where is it in the police reports that the Zodiac had scars at all? But they talked a little bit more about Gary Post's bizarre activities, and that is that he would organize a group of people whom he claimed he was training for various aspects of outdoorsmanship, and they say that Gary Post called his group the Posse, and I remember from reading up on him in the past, particularly from the Tahoe Daily Tribune, that he would take these men into the woods, and he had a fascination with torturing animals, but he would also set traps for bears. And, I mean, the torturing animals part, okay, absolutely condemn that. But as far as setting traps in the woods, yeah, that's called a hunting trip. It's called a trapping trip. I mean, taking a bunch of guys into the woods looking for animals, I mean, that's a hunting trip. I mean, I really wish I could have been a fly on the wall, or a fly in the forest, rather, as Gary Post would have organized some of these meetings with the posse. And just curious how they would present this, but the theory involving Gary Francis Post is shared in two ways. Number one, it comes to us from Dale Julin, who is a journalist and actually has somewhat of a strong ability to articulate the facts of the case. But then there's also this group that Dale Julin has partnered with called the Case Breakers, led by Tom Colbert, and they just have no credibility at all, absolutely zero, and they are very, very borderline pathetic when it comes to sharing their material to the mainstream media. And I think that after learning about Gary Francis Post and listening to all of these stories about him, perhaps it's fair to say that he wasn't a savory individual. He wasn't the nicest person in the world. He wasn't even a good person, although I don't want to judge someone I've never met and just going off of stories on the internet. But when you put all of it together, it's that whole concept of wherever there's smoke, there's fire, and that's a whole lot of smoke. And he seemed like somewhat of an abusive person. But does that mean he was the Zodiac Killer? No. And also, there was a line in that History Channel program that said, Gary Post confessed to someone that he was responsible for one of the Zodiac crimes. But I thought it was very odd that the History Channel show would not follow up with, well, okay, I mean, let's hear the full story. They just moved on to something else. And, I mean, isn't that the whole thing? Isn't that the whole thing they're trying to talk about? Greatest unsolved mysteries. Well, why don't you tell us about this confession to one of the crimes? And I do have to move on to a particular point that I will challenge more strongly than anything else in the show. I mean, overall, I thought they did very well presenting the stories about Arthur Lee Allen, Richard Gaikowski, and summarizing the Zodiac crimes in order. But the point that I will challenge most strongly is, they also talked about the possible Zodiac victim Sherry Jo Bates, who was murdered on October 30th of 1966 outside of the Riverside City College library. And they said that a month later, somebody had wrote a confession letter called the Riverside Confession, and it's the one that says she was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead, and it goes on to detail how this person committed the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. So, the claim that was made by the History Channel show is that it is written in a similar tone and style to that of the Zodiac Killer letters. I have to say 99.9% no. I don't think so. That's just not true. Similar tone and style, the overwhelming majority of Zodiac communications were handwritten, and the Riverside confession was typed. Number 2, the Zodiac Killer did a lot of things very differently than the author of the Riverside confession. Number 1, Sherry Jo Bates is mentioned by name. The person writing the letter, I almost said the killer, but the person who authored the confession said, Miss Bates went to the slaughter like a lamb. Miss Bates was stupid, she went to the slaughter like a lamb. Excuse me. She is addressed by name. The victims in the Zodiac crimes were not. The Zodiac would say things to the effect of, I am responsible for the murders of the 2 teenagers at Lake Herman last Christmas and the girl on the 4th of July. I'm paraphrasing, trying my best, but not identifying them by name. Also, the author of the Riverside confession is saying very clearly that he is going to target females. He says, beware, I'm stalking your girls now. Maybe he'll go after the blonde or the brunette. I mean, he's saying that he's only going to target females. The Zodiac murdered David Faraday, a male. The Zodiac murdered Paul Stein, a male. And the Zodiac shot 2 other victims. Shot one other male victim, Mike Peugeot, and he stabbed another victim, Brian Hartnell. So, what I'm noticing is that is just filled with differences of overwhelming proportions. And there are some misspellings in the Riverside confession, and the Zodiac misspelled words, I'll give them that. There is, the threat to kill future victims, and the Zodiac also did that. I will give them that, but the way in which the author of the confession goes about it is so different than the Zodiac's activities. And to be very honest with you guys, I don't believe the Zodiac murdered Sherry Jo Bates. I don't think the Riverside confession was written by the Zodiac. And I don't think the Zodiac wrote the desktop poem. I don't think the Zodiac had anything to do with the Bates had to die letters. Those have even been attributed to a hoaxer, more or less. So you can see very clearly, I just don't think the Bates crime was Zodiac activity. What I do think is that the Zodiac was very familiar with it. And that's how I would like to move on to a different crime from 1966, the same year that Sherry Jo was murdered, but that is the South Chicago Massacre committed by Richard Speck. If you didn't hear the Anything Goes Friday segment, which came out last week, do a little bit of recapping. Firstly, Richard Speck was a mass murderer. It's possible that he was a serial killer and that he had a cooling off period in between his murders, but, he has not been convicted for other crimes. He was sentenced to death for murdering 8 women who were student nurses in a townhouse on the south side of Chicago. His sentence was then commuted to life with parole, and he never got out of prison. He passed away in 1991. And more or less my assessment of him in the episode was that he's not like some type of psychological mystery. He was a jerk who got out of control. He was a criminal who just kept committing crimes, and his criminal behavior escalated to the point where he murdered multiple women on a single night. And the South Chicago Massacre happened when Richard Speck entered a townhouse on the south side of Chicago, and he held 9 women hostage. And he tied them up with strips of bedsheet, and then he took them out one by one and stabbed them to death and strangled some of them, and he raped the final victim that he stabbed. I said there were 9 women and 8 fatalities. There was one survivor of it, and her name was Corazon Amaral, and she survived by hiding under a bed, and they think that Richard Speck simply lost count of how many women were in the room, or maybe at that point he simply didn't care because he attempted suicide shortly after, which was unsuccessful. But the Zodiac Killer connection is very blatant, and I'm shocked that more people aren't talking about this. And that is that Richard Speck enters the townhouse, and he tells the women, all I want is your money. I'm trying to get to New Orleans. And absolutely the first thing that I thought about was the Zodiac killer's activities at Lake Berryessa on September 27th of 1969, and the Zodiac murdered victims by knife only once, or he murdered one victim in that incident, Cecilia Shepard. Brian Hartnell, the male victim, survived. But the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa said, "All I want is your money. I'm trying to get to Mexico." And when you think about it geographically, New Orleans is south of Illinois, where Chicago is. Mexico is south of California, where the Bay Area is. It's just so similar. Richard Speck approached the townhouse with a knife and a gun. The Zodiac killer approached Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard with a knife and a gun. The Zodiac tied up the victims in the South Chicago massacre. Richard Speck tied up the victims at the South Chicago massacre. The Zodiac tied up the victims at Lake Berryessa. I mean, there's this fake story. There were the bindings, the stabbing, having a gun and not using it. So clearly to me, that seemed like that the Zodiac would have learned about that story from 1969. By 1969, again, the South Chicago Massacre occurred in 1966. And some of you might be wondering, well, was it publicized? Yes. The media referred to that as the crime of the century. And the other crimes of the century, of course, would be the Lindbergh baby and the crimes which have been attributed to O.J. Simpson. They have also been known to have received that title. But I don't think that should be downplayed. I mean, very similar language. And let's look at some differences for counterbalance, even though, again, I'm taking a strong stance. I do believe that the Zodiac would have been inspired by Richard Speck to commit the Lake Berryessa stabbing, but we have to provide counterbalance all the same. Number one, Richard Speck was a home invader. He murdered the women in the townhouse. The Zodiac killer was not. He committed all of his murders outside, and with the exception of Paul Stein, who was murdered in a taxicab. Number two, the Zodiac wore a hooded costume while he committed the murder with a symbol on it. Richard Speck did not. And number three, perhaps the most obvious, 9 women were attacked by a single man, and only 2 victims were attacked by the Zodiac. There was a male victim present at Lake Berryessa, and there was not a male victim present during the South Chicago massacre. So there are a wide range of differences, and it could just very simply be that somebody was telling a fake story to put the victims in a false sense of security. I think that's definitely true, but what if there's an additional layer that the Zodiac was very familiar with the 1966 crimes of Richard Speck, and that was an inspiration for all the differences at Lake Berryessa? So that's just my take on the subject, but I would love to know your responses in the comments section down below. Right now, I would like to move on to another segment here on Zodiac Monday, and we're going to get into some true crime talk territories, but there are going to be some comparisons and contrasting with the Zodiac Killer mystery. This request comes to us from Midnight Ventures, who says, "Ned, follower for a long time, can I ask you to look into a case up north in the 80s? I honestly think you'd be interested in covering it. It's the Connecticut River Valley Killer. You can find one episode on Unsolved Mysteries and a few decent documentaries here on YouTube. It's an unsolved case of a string of murders and attacks that's intriguing." And yes, Midnight Ventures, of course, a long-time listener to this program. You know, Midnight Ventures once requested that I change the name of BBOR to Zodiac Online Radio. In fact, it was more just stated as a command, new name, Zodiac Online Radio. You see, it's so much better when you ask politely and formally like this. Yes, I did just that. I watched the episode of Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack about the Connecticut River Valley Killer, a serial killer, or a set of homicides that took place in the 1980s, going all the way up to 1988. And the final victim was actually a survivor, and she appeared in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, although they blacked out her face, and her amount of survival skills on that one were just I mean, overwhelming to think about. The will to live and so on. She was pregnant at the time. She was stabbed 18 times, and she still got to her car and drove away. And her name is Jane Borowski. Again, she appeared in the video. They refer to her as Jane, but um, her face was not shown. And that was the final crime on August 6th of 1988. So, my immediate response to this one was, the Connecticut River Valley killer was responsible for at least 7 crimes, and he appears to have been an abductor, someone who would go after women in vulnerable places, rest stops, maybe even truck stops, parked in a car along the side of the road, and he would abduct women and then take them to locations. And they tried to compose the psychological profile of the killer on Unsolved Mysteries by saying that he's doing this to have his way with them. He wants to dominate them, and he wants to put them in a location, both physically and mentally, where he's in control. I'm paraphrasing all of that, and not to toot my own horn or anything, but I think my paraphrasing was better than the way they presented it. But that's the point, and I follow all of that. I agree with it. It was a convincing narrative. However, let's look at some differences between the way that killer would have operated compared to the Zodiac. And no, I'm not saying the Connecticut River Valley killer is the Zodiac. Midnight Ventures didn't request that either. I just wanted to talk about this on Zodiac Monday. Number 1, the Zodiac does not abduct the victims. I don't even think the Zodiac abducted Kathleen Johns. The Zodiac is somebody who wants to commit the crime and run away, not spending an extended period of time with the victims. But a very strong similarity between the two of them is something that was even brought up on Unsolved Mysteries, and that was that the victims may not have been pre-chosen. In the Connecticut River Valley case, the locations were more likely to have been pre-chosen, that this person is trying to patrol, scout, or look for locations where women might be, women in vulnerable places, and then going after them. I mean, 7 women over a period of perhaps 8 years. I mean, how do we really know how many? But, I mean, this just goes to show you that that there is a lot of unsolved elements to the crime. So, I also think that that's a reasonable assessment, by the way, that the victims are not pre-chosen, that this person's just looking for certain locations. But a big difference between the way the Zodiac killer most likely operated is the Zodiac probably had intense familiarity with California because he lived there, whereas the Connecticut River Valley killer may not even have lived in the state of Connecticut. And that was one of the first things that they talked about on the program, and that was that this might be somebody who just drives a lot, someone who is just on the road very frequently because of work, or, I mean, maybe because of some type of family situation, and they have an excuse for being out of the house all the time, and they have an excuse for driving up and down the roads at late nights and odd hours. And a lot of people look to serial killer mysteries involving long-haul truckers, except the surviving witness said that the suspect was driving a Jeep Wagoneer. And I shouldn't even use the word suspect. How about assailant? And she talked about how he drove away from the crime scene, and she was able to, of course, see his face throughout the ordeal, and there are composite sketches of the killer from multiple occasions. One time he's wearing glasses, one time he's not. From the attack on Jane Borowski, he was not wearing the glasses. But she said that he was just looking at her as he drove away, and her belief was that she expected that he thought she was gonna die, that he left her for dead. She had been stabbed 18 times. He thought that she wouldn't survive those. That's why he just drove away. But, I mean, she really put up a fight, and that's the point. That's the point. the Connecticut River Valley Killer is not trying to secure the victims and make them defenseless. The Connecticut River Valley Killer is bringing the victims to places where they have the ability to fight back. Oh, he wants to have his way with them, and most of the time he does. But he's not securing them in a way that the Zodiac Killer did. The Zodiac either blindsided the victims, or tied them up, or even picked on people who were rather defenseless, bringing a gun instead of a knife, holding someone up at gunpoint, rather than trying to abduct them and bring them to secluded areas in the woods. Very, very different crimes. And I know that this is going to sound a little bit twisted, but the Zodiac Killer had somewhat of a smart reason for doing that. Perhaps the Connecticut River Valley Killer wasn't thinking in a smart way, but rather in a power-tripping kind of way. He wanted the victims to have the ability to fight back. And some people think that after the attack on Jane Borowski, again, not a murder, she survived. After the attack on Jane Borowski, the Connecticut River Valley murder stopped, and they even had a title card at the end of the episode saying that Jane Borowski had her own suspect, and she believed that he was a former military man who committed suicide shortly after their encounter. So, I think that it will be unsolved, but let's not kid ourselves. The Zodiac was a coward. The Zodiac was a weakling. The Zodiac was a pathetic individual, no matter who he was. However, he did put certain things in place that would prevent the victims from fighting back. Whereas not only the Connecticut River Valley Killer did that, but did not do that, the attacker of Sherry Jo Bates did not do that. And, I mean, if anything, the Connecticut River Valley Killer seems like somebody who would have attacked Sherry Jo Bates. Very different activities compared to that of the Zodiac Killer. I mean, that's a similar crime, because some people think that Sherry Jo was supposed to have been abducted by the killer, and she fought back, so the person murdered her on the site. And a very similar crime happened to Jane Borowski, except for the fact that, well, she survived the stabbing, and they use the word miraculously surviving on Unsolved Mysteries, simply saying that the knife didn't puncture any of her vital organs, even though she was stabbed 18 times. And I should say stabbed and slashed, so there may have been some injuries that were not extremely lethal, if you counting all of those things like superficial lacerations. However, horrible, horrible ordeal. And I think that we have to look at the way in which these killers are operating. And with the pre-Zodiac crimes, whether it's the murder of Ray Davis, the Domingos Edwards murders, the Swindle murders, the Bates murder, all of those, I think, are drastically different compared to that of the Zodiac Killer. But I would love to know what you guys think, and I would love to read your responses. But the biggest thing that I want to know from you is, what do you think about that statement from Richard Speck that he was trying to put his victims in a false sense of ease and security by telling them, I'm just trying to get to New Orleans. All I want is your money. I'm trying to go to New Orleans. And the Zodiac Killer saying, all I want is your money. I'm trying to get to Mexico. I mean, it's so similar. Unless some way, somehow, you could demonstrate how nobody in California would have known about the South Chicago Massacre, the crime of the century, and so on. But I also want to point out some things. Whether it's the unsolved Zodiac Killer mysteries, like the pre-Zodiac crimes, as I listed them all from 1962 to 1966 or 7, and some things like the Connecticut River Valley Killer, where they are not completely certain as to did the same person even commit these crimes. And this is something that I hope to explore more in the future, and I'm having a hard time labeling it. The name that comes to mind is serial killer legends. And I'm using the word legend not because it's praiseworthy, but because they are stories, and the storytelling aspect seems to unite a series of murders, but we aren't even sure if it's the same killer. For example, somebody was just talking to me about the book, The Flat Tire Murders by Michael P. Burns. And I said, yeah, I've read some of it, and I did one episode about it here on Black Box Online Radio. And the first chapter in The Flat Tire Murders is about the Miami Strangler. And that's a serial killer legend. It's the possibility that a series of homicides took place in the state of Florida, and was it the same person or not? And there's some similar crimes that took place. However, I believe the final victim in that one, Clara Anomaly, was not murdered by the Miami Strangler. And it's been about a year and a half since I've done the episode, so please don't quote me on this one. But the thing that stands out to me is I think I remember something about how she was smothered with something as opposed to being strangled. And there were a few other major differences. In Chapter 2 of The Flat Tire Murders by Michael P. Burns, even differentiates the murder of Clara Anomaly to the other Miami Strangler victims. But maybe a more extreme example of this would be the smiley face killers theory. The idea that certain men are being murdered near water sources or they're being drowned, and that there's a gang of serial killers or even a serial killer movement that a tag is left behind with a smiley face, graffiti is left behind with a smiley face, and there's a couple variants of the theory. There's the idea that there is a that there are these people abducting college-age men who are primarily Caucasian, and they're drowning them, and then they're dumping the bodies and leaving the smiley face. And the other theory is that this is just not a single group of people, but it's an international movement where people are doing this, almost like a disgusting challenge. Then there's even the counter argument theory, the skeptical theory to all of it, that the smiley face is just a very common graffiti mark, and it's found in countless places. I even posted one on Instagram, BlackBoxNet88 on Instagram, where there was a river in Williamsport, Maryland, actually, not in West Virginia. Like there's a smiley face on a log, and I mean this definitely happens, and it's a very common piece of graffiti. But another example of this would be the Manchester Canals pusher in England. Similar story, it's just there is possibly a serial killer who's targeting people near the canals, or possible murders that are taking place. And it's also possible that when people are disoriented near water sources, the possibility of drowning is much higher. Another example of a serial killer quote-unquote legend would be Jack the Ripper. I mean, we aren't even necessarily sure if the same person committed the 5 canonical Ripper murders, and then, much like the Zodiac killer, there are pre-Ripper murders and post-Ripper murders. I was just talking about one of them on last week's Jack the Ripper segment, and that was the murder of Rose Milett, which took place after the murder of Mary Kelly, and it goes on, and they think that they're Ripper crimes in 1891 as opposed to 1888, and it turns into some type of serial killer legend. And in the book, Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer by Zed Simpson, it's referred to as the Jack the Ripper complex, and I've been so tempted to either write a book myself, but probably not, because I just give everything to you guys for free. I would just make a YouTube episode for the Anything Goes Friday segment called the Zodiac Killer Complex, talking about how people are connecting these very odd crimes to the Zodiac Killer. One of them that was mentioned in the History Channel show that I did not talk about was the Monster of Florence, about how the Zodiac crimes happen in the 60s, and then there's this Italian serial killer that takes shape in the 70s, called the Monster of Florence. And I mean, the reason I didn't include that one is I want to do a much bigger segment on that, and I also want to do a much more thorough investigation. I want to learn more about that. I don't want to just do a very general discussion on the Monster of Florence as a serial killer, because I think that there is a very big presentation that is necessary. But that's all for me now, and I would like to thank everyone for listening to this episode. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.